Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 1 forwards, or rather the cheat sheet for the forwards. And if you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of a certain position. FPL, we cover all positions usually closer towards the deadline. Right now, because there's so much information to be gained with the preseason, I thought it'd be useful to do my review of the forwards and give a lot of explanations in terms of why I have so many asterisks on the forwards, unfortunately because of expected transfer market activity or even uncertainty around injuries. Another mention about the cheat sheet is it is related in terms of price. So you will see that players are ranked in price order, and I've effectively looked at the price effectiveness of a player. Now, there are some players like Haaland where you can argue that he's not cost effective, but the reality with premium players are they are meant to be captaincy options, and that's factored into their cost. So that makes a huge difference in FPL. Before we get started with the cheat sheet, I'd like to say that all these stats in this video have been used with the FF Hub Opta stats. So this is the sort of advanced data that you can use from last season, and you'll be able to keep track of even this season's data as we get started and we go along from Game Week 1 onwards. And all of that is provided by Fantasy Football Hub. They've packaged the Opta stats in a very nice and neat way for managers to assess them. You can also use Fantasy Football Hub to find projected data for expected points, clean sheet percentages, things like that, so on and so forth. So do stay tuned for Fantasy Football Hub. The link is in the description below if you want to have a look at it. So let's quickly look at the forwards. At 4.5, I think Stewart makes the most sense from Southampton. He seems like someone who could fill in, considering that Che Adams has already left towards the Serie A, and he'll probably play more minutes right now than some of the other forwards for the time being, right? We've got Fraser as well, I suppose, who's another 4.5 option, but once again, upside isn't really there, and I think the minutes are also pretty diminished. He should also just be a rotation option like he has been in recent years. As far as the next tier, it's 5.5, and I think the biggest asterisk for now goes towards João Pedro. A lot of people immediately identified him as a bit of a game breaker, and I can understand both sides of the argument, right? You can definitely say that João Pedro is someone who has shown that he's a little bit injury prone. He's also someone who is competing with a lot of people in the team, right? We have Minte, of course, coming and joining this Brighton team. Mitoma's back fit. Ferguson is back fit. And Undav had a great season. And so the question, I suppose, is what sort of structure will we see from this Brighton team? Will João Pedro fit in immediately in any sort of position, right? Even Welbeck, for example, is still in the side. And so there's a little bit of restriction in terms of the minutes that he can get, I suppose, in the center forward position. So it's a question about whether he can fill in some of these winger minutes or rather, play in the 10 as a consistent option. And I think, of course, we have to say maybe his minutes could be a little bit reduced because now that they have so much depth and right now no one's being loaned out, it's very plausible that João Pedro is interesting because he's a penalty taker, which I think will not change because he's a good penalty taker. But you're also looking at João Pedro, unfortunately, playing maybe worse roles. And of course, if you see a forward and he's not playing in the center forward position, it's not actually great for FPL because you tend to, as a forward, want to get bonus points for actions that a forward will do. What is nice is some of the BPS changes do benefit João Pedro. He does take shots on target and he also does draw fouls. So I think at this price point, he's still, even if he played 70 minutes per game, if you told me that he was going to start every single match, I do think he's a very good option. But that's a pretty big if. And I can understand people going on the complete flip side of that and just thinking that his minutes aren't there. And that's fine. We'll have to see based on the preseason. But I'm generally a little bit higher on João Pedro than most anyways. As far as Armstrong, I think he's a bit of a no-brainer on most FPL drops. Now, some people don't like the aspect of having a rotation piece. I will say what's nice about the forward position this season is it feels like a lot more of the steals are in that sort of 5.5 to 6 million price point. And when you compare traditionally to previous seasons, we had a lot more steals in the midfield position. Now, obviously, when you look at the midfield video, which will probably be recommended in the exclamation mark above, yes, you have options like someone like Rogers. You have some great 5.5s, but I do think that some of the 5.5s outside of maybe Andreas, if he gets penalties and that becomes completely locked onto him, right? When Willian, let's say, leaves the club, if that gets confirmed, then outside of Andreas, I don't really see too many midfielders holding the sort of value that Armstrong would have, right? 90 minutes a game is huge. Yes, of course, you don't expect much from Southampton, but he would still be the main focal point of the team. His minutes last season were perfect. I can't see how they wouldn't be this season. He plays multiple roles for the team, and I think whatever happens in terms of whether they choose to invest more into the forward position, he will play every game and he will be the penalty taker. So for that makes Armstrong for me a very, very good pick. And there's no real downsides to him as an FPL pick. I think even as an 8th attacker, maybe even as a permanent starter, if you really want to create a very rigid, tight structure, he does make sense as a pick to me. Now, moving on, we have the 6.0 position. I think Wood and Muniz are straight off the bat great options, and that's because Wood and Muniz both have great fixtures. Whilst both players might not have penalties, because I do believe penalties belong to Morgan Gibbs White for Forest, but you can definitely argue that Wood could have a claim in it. Wood has a stellar penalty record himself. In fact, I think it's so good that I previously last season was in the camp where I thought it was a bit of a 50-50 between Morgan Gibbs White and Wood. And that's great, right? Because if you believe that Wood is a penalty taker within the team, his value increases in FPL, and that just makes him even better. I think even cautiously, if you think Morgan Gibbs White is most likely going to be the penalty taker, Wood is still a great pick because the fixtures are great, really good home fixtures. Even some of the away fixtures early on are nice. His expected goal stats are incredible, right? And that's not even taking penalties. It really does rival amongst some of the best forwards in the league. So he's absolutely not anyone to scoff at. Now, Muniz is an interesting pick because we don't think he's on penalties. I think it more than likely will go back to Willian if he resigns, which seems unlikely, or simply Andreas, who has taken penalties before. He's also never taken a career penalty. What is nice about Muniz, though, is his underlying stats with the limited minutes that he played last season were good. And I do think that his minutes are strong too, right? Going back to Wood, for example, some people will definitely say that Awoniyi can challenge his minutes. I think that's fine. I still think that Wood will be the out-and-out starter. And I do think that Nuno does prefer him. And I think he's been a very strong, effective, stable option who can play. I think the same can be very much said with Muniz. You have Raul Jimenez, probably challenging for a few minutes, but I see Muniz as a little bit more of an 80 minutes player. Maybe that's a bit of a rich estimation, but even speaking to some of my friends who are Fulham fans, they seem to be of that camp as well. As I said, it's not likely that he has penalties. That would be a huge sort of plus to him that we didn't anticipate. But the bonus point changes have also really helped, right? The BPS in terms of fouls drawn, he's actually very good at that. In terms of shots on target, he's also very good at that. And once again, his underlying stats are very solid. Plus, Fulham's fixtures are very nice to start the season. So I do also really like Muniz as an option. The next pick is going to be Calvert-Lewin, and for me, he's just a tier below because I have genuine issues with his sort of injury proneness, and I think that there's a general match fitness issue. Plus, of course, they have backups in the sense that Calvert-Lewin can still be subbed off at 70-75 minutes. Whilst I can make the argument that João Pedro could actually get 90 minutes a game, and maybe that's a little bit of an overestimation, I think for Calvert-Lewin to get 90 minutes a game is a bit of a reach. And so even if he's a permanent starter, I still think that his minutes are a little bit capped, to be quite honest. And so because of that, I don't love Calvert-Lewin too much. I also think the opening fixtures for Everton from an attacking perspective aren't particularly good. We also know that Calvert-Lewin is oddly one of the worst finishers in the league, and I'm someone who likes to rely on a lot of data, but we have, in my opinion, enough data with Calvert-Lewin to know that he's a little bit of a poor finisher. Even, for example, for some of the other players in this list, like Darwin and Havertz, they have not reached the sort of stratospheric negative finishing thresholds that Calvert-Lewin has. Jesus maybe has, but they are. I mean, he is someone that I've constantly, I would say, ridiculed in the channel as a finisher. Jesus is obviously incredible for many other things outside of finishing, but I can't really say the same about Calvert-Lewin, so I don't really love him as a pick, if I'm honest. Thiago has a big asterisk, and this is Igor Thiago from Brentford. The fixtures are actually quite good in terms of the on and off aspect for Brentford. So there are great fixtures, and then there are horrible fixtures sandwiched in between. And I think if you can rotate around that, Thiago becomes interesting as long as Tony leaves the club. There is an asterisk to Tony, though, because he's still at Brentford, and he still most likely will start. Wissa is someone who probably will lose out the most, I imagine, for the starting minutes this season if Tony stays. Thiago will not have penalties, and that's a bit of a dampener there. So for now, I think he's just a differential. If Tony leaves the club, he might not even get penalties still, but at 6.0 for a Brentford striker, I do like his price because I expect for him to be a consistent starter and to probably play more minutes than someone like Wissa did last season. And Wissa was still a very good performer anyways. Cunha is an interesting pick. He's not on penalties, as far as I understand. I still think Hwang would take penalties over him. We have Sarabia in the team as well, who could very well take penalties ahead of him, and that sort of dampens him as a pick. Plus, the Wolves fixtures aren't particularly great. Yes, of course, you have some decent fixtures later down the line for Wolves, but we'll only really consider then. And for now, just not someone I'm interested in. Richarlison is going to be a great pick. He'd probably be, honestly, a green pick if I knew he was going to start the season, and if I knew he wasn't going to be transferred out. But because he's involved in so much sort of transfer news and stories, one of the issues, I suppose, with also picking someone who could very well transfer clubs and actually move out of the league is that forces a transfer for you. So if you start, let's say, game week 1 with Richarlison and he leaves somehow before the transfer window closes, then that's a free transfer you have to make. And so whilst the fixtures opening are very good for Tottenham, I still think there's a risk to going with Richarlison at the start. And because I don't think he's on penalties either, it's not like you're missing on a huge sort of budget steal to start with. Solanke's a great pick. There are some great fixtures and some sort of mediocre fixtures sandwiched in for Bournemouth. But as the key talisman of the team, someone who has penalties, really, really good minutes. Last season, he actually played the most minutes out of all forwards. So one thing that I think we miss out on sometimes in FPL is the reliability of a player, right? How often they are injured, how often they play 90 minutes a game. So players like Bruno, players like Watkins, players like Solanke are definitely very undervalued from that perspective. And Solanke brings that to the table. So I like that a lot from him. And I would still class him as a green pick, really, to start the season because he's that reliable. And I do think that we saw a lot from Iraola last season to be comfortable about Solanke, getting that price increase, but still being worthwhile as a pick. Mateta, unfortunately, is involved in the Olympics, so there's an asterisk ascribed to him. Maybe he might return home a little bit earlier, but I find that a little bit doubtful. The French team is strong, and I do think he's probably going to stay a while. And that means, no preseason training camp for him with Crystal Palace. It might mean that Edouard could start ahead of him. So that's why I'm a little bit lower on Mateta for now. But I still think nothing to scoff at in terms of that end of season run. He was absolutely insane. Definitely overperformed a lot when you compare it to the underlying data. But who knows? If he can continue to perform like that, I think we just might have to respect him just that bit more. With Gakpo and Darwin, I think you have similar risks in the sense that I think Gakpo is probably going to be a little bit preferred by the coach, maybe because he might be able to utilize Gakpo a bit better on that left-hand side. Darwin is an interesting one, right? We always know that he's got great underlying stats. The BPS changes do definitely benefit him, right? Whilst he is someone who can create big chances missed, whilst he's also someone who can, shoot shots off target. What I've noticed from Darwin is that his shot on target accuracy is actually no different to key players like Salah, like even and the figures are actually close to Watkins and Haaland. So it's mostly the big chances created, or rather missed stat that hurts Darwin the most in terms of BPS. But there are some new changes in BPS that do really help him. And once again, the underlying stats are there. The question, of course, is going to be minutes at the start of the season, because I do think that we'll see probably quite a bit of rotation, despite the fixtures being so good for Liverpool. And because none of these players are on penalties, I do think that takes away from them a little bit, and that's why I'm not super sold on either Gakpo or Darwin. If you are, let's say, based on preseason, leaning a little bit more towards a player because you think that their minutes can be a lot better than we expect as of right now, that's okay, because the cheat sheet will update as well based on the preseason and sort of my intonations as to what a manager's tactics are. But because it's so fresh, it's so new, I don't even know, for example, what position Sob was going to play, how Jota will be utilized, these sorts of things. I'm not that confident ultimately in either pick right now. With Tony, unfortunately, it's a differential just because of the sort of variability with the transfer news. If he gets, transferred into Spurs before the start of the season or even later down the line, he becomes a great pick, and we'll have to sort of judge based on that. With Jackson, I also think he's a differential. We've heard Maresca talk about how Nkunku can play multiple positions. That probably means that his minutes will be a little bit dicier than what they were under Pochettino. Under Pochettino, he was close to an 89-90 minute player per game. And I think, of course, the pressing attribute of Darwin, or rather Jackson, was something that was very much, in the preference of Pochettino. But we are looking at a new manager. Jackson will definitely play a lot of minutes this season. I think that's without or out of the question, but his utility is probably not as insane as it could have been maybe under Pochettino, and it's a bit of a wait and see for me. I still think at that price point, Nkunku screams to me as the option to go for, particularly over Jackson, and I do think he's definitely one I'd swerve right now until we're extremely fond of Chelsea as a team, and for whatever reason, if we ever want to step into a triple up, we can make that decision then. What's interesting is after this price point, right, a lot of weird picks at 7.0 to 7.5. After that, we've actually got, in my opinion, picks that are amazing. Havertz, a lot of people might have some reservations against. Yes, of course, moving from midfield to forward, just like Richarlison, you do lose clean sheet points, you do lose goal scored points as well. But the BPS will clearly favor a forward as well. And what's nice about Havertz is there are two Havertz, right? There's the Havertz as the 8, and there's the Havertz as the center forward. What I've looked at from a website like Understat is that he is someone who is very clearly impacted by the position. When he plays as a center forward, his XG averages is around 0.67. When he plays as a midfielder, his XG averages are around 0.31 per 90. And so you can clearly see that there's a big dichotomy there. What the question is about Havertz is about how you think Arteta will start this season. I tend to think that Arteta will start the season exactly how he left off. It was a winning formula. It was something that was continuing to work. I don't think there's any reason to switch off in. Yes, of course, there are some games where Havertz might get subbed off at 80 minutes, but for the most part, he was a 90-minute player. He played most of his minutes as a center forward, and sometimes, of course, if let's say Jesus would come onto the field, you see Havertz sub on, or rather move down into the pitch as a center mid. So if I was to weight how much he'd play at center forward to the center mid position, I'd say it's probably around 75-25. That's my estimation. I can't see Arteta immediately trying to move back into what didn't work last season very clearly, which is Havertz as an 8 and being stubborn. I personally think Arteta is quite pragmatic. He saw something that worked. He persisted with it at the end of last season. I think Havertz will start this season as a center forward, and that's why I really like Havertz at the start. With Isak, there's absolutely no asterisks. It seems like Wilson is out for the start of the season. Isak is on penalties if that's the case. Isak has amazing minutes. He's come back from injury very strong, very fit. He's played 90 minutes outside of the time where he was ill. If you remember, there was a window where within the triple fixture window within a week that Newcastle played close to the sort of game week 30s, 35s sort of time period of the season, Howe mentioned that he was sick and unfortunately his minutes were a bit poor. But for the most part, Isak at the back half of the season was a 90-minute player. And even when Wilson was fit, he was also a 90-minute player. And that is what I like the most about Isak. We saw Newcastle try multiple different formations and tactics, and Isak was still quintessential to both of them. And the same applies really to Anthony Gordon. So I like these picks the most from Newcastle, and his underlying stats are incredible. He's, as I said, most likely on penalties and just a great pick going forwards. With Watkins and Haaland, the case with Watkins is around that game week 2 fixture. It's not great. You probably want someone like Armstrong to cover it. However, after that, Watkins is effectively an amazing pick. I can see people maybe going for Isak at the start, then pivoting towards Watkins, which is fine. What I like about Watkins is very much what I like about Solanke, what I like about Bruno Fernandes. You're looking at a player here who is going to give you 90 minutes per game. There are no real downsides to going for this player. He could very well have penalties by the start of the season. As I said, penalties could go to Tielemans, who's not really a starting player for this team, or it could go to someone else if Watkins really doesn't want to take up the mantle, because yes, of course, his penalty taking stats previously in the past are abominable. But no one else in the squad, or at least in the starting squad, actually has a good penalty record. And I think that counts a lot in terms of how they're going to assess who's the penalty taker going forwards. And if he's a penalty taker, he becomes even better as a pick. Is he a little bit overpriced? I would say not. Watkins is the key player of the team. And as we can see with the bonus changes, the more key you are as an attacker, the more you're going to benefit. No one else in this team has similar underlying stats to him anyways, with exception to Bailey, who plays less minutes. And so Watkins is someone who's more than likely just going to continue benefiting. As if you had a look at maybe Above Average's podcast on the bonus changes, he was another benefactor, and it's not due to, for example, a position change. It's just due to the fact that he's a key player for the team, he's an attacker, and his baselines are key. With Haaland, once again, it's all about price, and it's all about the captaincies. I can see a lot of people now thinking about Salah and Haaland. I don't love the drafts too much, if I'm honest. I feel like there's a cost to it. Haaland only or Salah only, for me, is the way to go. And I don't really have any issues with players going either direction. Haaland has that game week 2 fixture, which is very, very scary. And he's the younger player of the two between Haaland and Salah, right? Yes, he has slightly worse fixtures compared to what Liverpool have on the plate. But is he arguably a better pick week to week? If the fixtures were equal compared to Salah, I would definitely say so. And so I can completely understand going and backing Haaland and backing the younger player here despite obviously the injury last season. And that's pretty much it. Haaland is an amazing pick. I don't expect anything less from him. When I looked at the predicted goals scored as per the betting markets, I believe he had 27. No one else in the league had above 20. And that just shows you the separation and the gulf that Haaland has brought to the league and the diversity he's brought to FPL this season with his updated pricing. But I still think he's an amazing pick. And that's going to be my Game Week 1 forward cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what your thoughts are on the forwards. Hopefully we get a bit more clarity on some of these positions. As we close into Game Week 1, as we get more information from the preseason, as people go in and out of their clubs, we will fine-tune this list a little bit more. And so do stay tuned for that. But otherwise, thank you once again.